Good morning. I'm Erika, the Director of Lifespan Faith Development here at First UU. This morning, as we hear from the youth of this congregation, I would like to share a story about a time when youth really made a big difference in a very important change. Once upon a time, there were two groups of people, the Unitarians and the Universalists. They probably didn't look quite like this, but that's okay. Perhaps you've heard of these two groups. These groups, these faith communities, existed for hundreds of years on their own. And at some point, they started to talk to each other about what it would be like to join together and become one larger faith community. And they started talking and talking, as grown-ups do. And it went on, and it went on, and it went on. And every year, both groups would get together and they'd meet and say, you know, we have so much in common with how we want to live in the world, with what we believe and think matters, and we'd probably be stronger together. Every year they'd meet about it, and then they'd go home again. This went on for years and years, many years, 5, 10 years. Meanwhile, the youth organizations of both groups, the teenagers from many, many congregations, both Unitarians and Universalists, were also meeting and talking about this. And eventually they said, that's it. We're ready to do this. We don't need to keep waiting for the grown-ups to finish talking. We think this is the right thing to do, and we are ready to merge now. So the youth organizations voted, and they became one group of Unitarian Universalist youth. 8 years later, the adults finally got it together, and they merged as well. And that's how Unitarian Universalism started. That's how we get to be UUs. And it was the youth who led the way. Now, as Unitarian Universalists, they agreed on a set of principles. Promises that they would all try to follow. How many principles? How many principles? Well, let's see. Maybe you've seen one of these before, these posters that we hand out and let people color themselves. My sister actually colored this one for me for my office. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Here, there are 7 principles. Or this poster has the official grown-up wording, but still, I count 7. But check this out. There were not always 7 principles. It's true. When the two groups first joined and became Unitarian Universalists, there were only 6 principles. 6. That's how many they thought of, and that's how many they thought was enough. It was a whole nother 25 years before people started to say, these 6 aren't quite right. Some of the wording didn't work, like, why were we always saying goodwill to men? What about the rest of us? So people got together and did a lot of talking and rewrote the principles. And they added the 7th principle, and that's the one about the earth and all the beings living on the earth and how we're all interconnected. That's a pretty important principle. It's so funny to think that we went so long without it. But how were we able to go from having 6 to 7? By talking and voting. One of the really cool things about our faith is that we are what's called a living tradition, alive, like a person, like an animal, like a tree. And when something is alive, it reacts and changes, adapts to what's going on around it. Because we are a living tradition, we could say, these 6 are not what we need anymore. Let's rewrite these and go for 7. But wait, here's a poster from another congregation. It hangs on their wall. And how many principles are there? 8 principles? What's going on here? And look, here too, 8 principles. And there's another, 8 principles. Well, about 6 years ago, two people that had been worked for a long time in our faith decided that it was time to start talking about adding a new principle, an eighth principle about being anti-racist. So they started to talk to people about it, and they talked to the UUA, which is the group of all the different UU congregations. As I said before, grown-ups have to talk and talk and talk a lot before we make big changes happen. And this is a pretty big change. But one of the cool things about Unitarian Universalism is that every congregation doesn't have to wait for the whole big group to make that decision. And some congregations have decided to go ahead and add the eighth principle. They think it's so important right now to be working against racism and other oppressions that they're not going to wait. And in a lot of places, youth are taking the lead again. In some congregations, the youth group or the RE program, the kids and youth all together, have decided that this eighth principle is so important that they don't want to wait for the grown-ups to finish talking. So they voted to adopt and act on the eighth principle within their programs, even before the rest of their congregations. So here is the eighth principle, as is written now, because with all of this talking, it could change. We affirm and promote journeying toward spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. Whew, that's quite a mouthful. But as usual, we have some simpler versions going around for kids, and here's one. We must work together for diversity and against racism and oppression. That's a little simpler. Here at First UU, we're just starting to hear about this proposed eighth principle. I wonder what will happen when we start to talk about it. I wonder if we'll decide to approve it before the UUA does. I wonder if our youth will lead the way.